I want to tell you something that happened on the station called Viral 9, in the outer rim of the Keth Expanse. Something that I still think about at night. I was there, I saw every second of it, and I'm telling you right now, if you had asked me that morning whether a single human could change the way an entire alien princess court looked at our species, I would have laughed. I'm not laughing anymore. Viral 9 is not a beautiful station. I want to get that out of the way early, because a lot of the records you'll find describe it with words like magnificent and architectural wonder, and those people were either paid to write that or they visited the upper tiers. I lived on Middeck 7 for 3 years before the incident, and Middeck 7 smells like recycled coolant and old protein paste, and the lights flicker every time the mass relay dock fires up, which is roughly every 40 minutes. But the station is important. It sits at the intersection of 4 major trade corridors: the Keth Corridor, the Voss Bypass, the Drelani Rim Route, and something the locals just called the Long Thread, which connects all the way out to territories most galactic maps don't even bother labeling. That means diplomats. That means merchants. That means species from places so far away they've evolved under entirely different suns, breathing entirely different air, looking at you with eyes that don't blink the way yours do. It means tension, too. Always tension. The Vethori Principality had been in extended negotiation talks with the Galactic Trade Assembly for going on 7 months when I arrived. The talks were mostly stalled. Had been stalled for 5 of those 7 months, from what I understood, because the Vethori didn't trust the Assembly's record on labor agreements, and the Assembly thought the Vethori were stalling for commercial leverage. Both were probably right. The Vethori are, well, let me describe them properly. They're tall, that's the first thing. Most of the adults I saw ranged between 7 and 8 feet in height, with a build that looks almost insected from a distance, but resolves into something more mammalian up close. Their skin shifts color in low light, not camouflage exactly, more like a mood indicator, a biological reflex they can suppress but never fully control. Blue-gold when calm, deep violet when agitated, red-black when genuinely threatened. Their society is structured around what they call the Velhari, the Great Bloodlines. Each bloodline has its own court, its own customs, its own ranking system that outsiders rarely understand fully. And at the top of every bloodline is a Neris, a princess sovereign, female by tradition, who combines the roles of military commander, diplomatic head, and living symbol of the bloodline's honor. Princess Verith of the Keth bloodline was 23 by their calendar, which works out to maybe 32 in human years. And she had arrived on Viral 9 6 days before the incident with a full diplomatic retinue, 12 honor guard soldiers, 3 advisors, and an attitude about humans that I'd call politely contemptuous on a good day. I knew this because I worked intake documentation for the diplomatic wing of the station. My official title was something like Senior Trade Record Analyst, which sounds important but essentially meant I processed shipping manifests, cross-referenced crew declarations, and occasionally sat in the back of meetings that were above my pay grade so that someone could take notes. I had done this job for almost 4 years. It was quiet. I liked quiet. The intake officer who briefed me on the Vethori delegation was a woman named Helpless. She was Draylan, bipedal, gray-skinned, extremely efficient, and one of the few people on Middeck 7 I genuinely respected. She pulled up the cultural briefing on her tablet and said, in her flat, precise way, "The Neris has indicated she does not require human staff interaction beyond what is operationally mandatory. She considers direct contact unnecessary." "Unnecessary," I repeated. "That is the word in the translation," Helpless said, "though the original Vethori term is closer to without purpose, or possibly without value. The nuance is difficult to render." I nodded. I'd heard variations of this before. Humans were a relatively young galactic presence. We'd only achieved interstellar travel about 260 years before the events I'm describing, and while that sounds like a long time in the context of a galaxy where some civilizations had been spacefaring for 40,000 years, we were new. We were small. We were, in many circles, considered fragile. The phrase that kept coming up in diplomatic briefings was soft-worlders. It had started as a technical designation. Earth's gravity, atmospheric pressure, and solar radiation levels were considered mild compared to several other inhabited worlds, which meant humans evolved in a relatively forgiving environment compared to, say, a Gret, who comes from a planet with 1.8 times standard gravity and atmospheric ammonia content high enough to kill most other species. Or a Kalvar, who evolved on a world where the predator-to-prey ratio at the top of the food chain was essentially inverted. But Softworlder had stopped being technical a long time ago. By the time I was working on Viral 9, it was just an insult. And Princess Vareth of the Keth bloodline used it the way some people use punctuation, casually, without thinking. Like it was just the natural descriptor for the category of beings we occupied. I'm going to tell you about the morning of the incident, and I'm going to tell you about the man who changed everything. His name was Corporal Davin Reyes. And I want to be honest, the first time I saw him, I thought he looked terrible. Introducing REYES. Davin Reyes was 31 years old, from a city in what used to be called Northern Colombia, and he had been assigned to the station's Human Diplomatic Security Unit 8 months before I met him. He was medium height, about 5 feet 11, and lean in that way some people get lean when they've had a hard life and worked it off. Dark hair cropped short. A jaw that looked like it had been introduced to a few things over the years that hadn't been gentle about it. He had this calm about him that I initially read as tiredness, and a quality of stillness that I later understood was something else entirely. The first time I properly noticed him was in the cafeteria on Middeck 7. He was sitting alone at the end of a long table, eating what the station menu generously called a protein blend, reading something on a small physical book, actual paper, which you almost never saw anymore. And he looked, genuinely, like a man who had decided the world could wait. He was also covered in scars. I don't mean a few, I mean the kind of coverage that makes you wonder about the story. Both forearms, the left side of his neck. Part of his collarbone visible above his collar. And on his right hand, something that looked less like a scar and more like a marking. A dark, patterned line running from his wrist to just below his knuckles, geometric in a way that didn't look accidental. I found out later from the station's small human community that Reyes had done 2 tours with something called a Frontier Response Unit, a specialized human military designation for deployment in environments outside standard planetary parameters. Basically, the people you sent when the environment was trying to kill you as hard as the enemy was. He'd been deployed on 3 different worlds with non-standard atmospheric or gravitational conditions. He'd been wounded twice. He'd come back both times. Nobody really talked to him much. He wasn't unfriendly, exactly. He just had that quality that some people develop when they've spent a lot of time in places where talking too much gets people killed. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed things. He had this habit of sitting with his back to a wall and facing the room, which I only noticed once I started paying attention to it, and then I couldn't stop noticing it. His official assignment on Viral 9 was perimeter security for the Human Diplomatic Section. Boring work mostly. The station had its own security force, and interspecies incidents at the diplomatic level were handled through formal protocol channels, not muscle. Reyes was, functionally, a presence, a symbol that the human delegation wasn't entirely unguarded. Princess Vareth had seen him twice during routine corridor crossings in the diplomatic wing, and according to the junior Vethori aide who later gave testimony to the incident review board, a testimony I was able to read because of my position, she had described him as, quote, a physically inferior specimen being used as a symbolic gesture. I read that and felt something complicated. Not because it was wrong, exactly. By Vethori standards of physical capability, their soldiers averaged 290 pounds of muscle, could perceive ultraviolet and infrared simultaneously, had a reflex response time roughly twice as fast as human baseline, and were trained from childhood in a combat philosophy that took 30 years to master fully. Yes. By those standards, Davin Reyes, 5 feet 11, lean, quiet, reading a paper book in the cafeteria looked like a symbolic gesture. By those standards. That's the thing about standards. They assume the standard is universal. The incident built tension. The incident began on a Tuesday, which I know because I had just filed the week's routing manifests and was looking forward to the 45 minutes between shift end and cafeteria opening, where I usually sat in the observation bay on the western side of Middeck 7 and watched the ships come in on the Keth corridor. The attack did not give me those 45 minutes. It came from inside the station. That was the part nobody expected. All the security focus was on inbound vessels, on access points, on the diplomatic wing's external perimeter. Nobody was looking at the internal maintenance network, the crawlspace system that ran behind every wall on every deck, used by engineering staff to access conduit junctions without disrupting foot traffic. The attackers were 3 individuals. 2 of them were Gret, which tells you something, because Gret mercenary work is expensive and rarely subtle. The 3rd was a species I didn't recognize then and still haven't been able to fully identify from the incident records, something vaguely reptilian with very long arms and a body structure built for enclosed spaces. We found out later they were hired by a faction within the Galactic Trade Assembly who didn't want the Vethori negotiations to conclude successfully. There's a longer story there about mineral rights and shipping exclusivity agreements that I'll skip because it's not the part that matters. What matters is that they came up through a maintenance hatch 40 meters from the Vethori diplomatic suite, in a corridor section that the station security rotation left unmonitored for 11 minutes every standard cycle. Someone had done their homework. I wasn't in that corridor when it started. I was 2 sections over, heading toward the observation bay, when the station's emergency tone fired, not the full evacuation alarm, just the security pulse. 3 short tones that meant incident in progress, non-evacuation, shelter if possible. I stopped. The corridor I was in had a viewport on one of the inner walls, a thick transparency panel that looked across the station's internal atrium toward the diplomatic wing. From where I was standing, I could see into the corridor section where it happened. Not perfectly, the angle was wrong, the distance was maybe 80 meters, but I could see it. I saw the 2 Gret emerge from the maintenance hatch. I saw the reptilian figure drop from the ceiling junction above. And I saw Princess Verith of the Keth bloodline, who had been walking from her suite toward the diplomatic conference chamber with 2 of her honor guard, stop dead, as the hallway suddenly contained 3 armed beings who had not been there a second before. The honor guard moved. You have to give them that. They moved fast, faster than I could track cleanly, and put themselves between the Naris and the threat. But the Gret were prepared for Vethori honor guard. They had suppression rods, weapons that deliver a localized electromagnetic pulse capable of disrupting the Vethori nervous system's electrochemical signaling, essentially a seizure induction device, and the honor guard dropped before they could close distance. Not dead, but down and down hard. The reptilian figure moved to cut off the corridor behind Verith. And Princess Verith, to her credit, did not panic. She shifted her color to deep violet, full threat awareness, and moved into a fighting stance I recognized from the cultural briefing materials as a Vethori Velhari-class combat form. She was, by all accounts, trained. She was the head of her bloodline. The Naris was never purely ceremonial. But there were 3 of them, and 2 of them were Gret, and the Gret there's a reason they cost what they cost as mercenaries. I watched her take a hit from the 2nd Gret's suppression rod. A glancing blow, caught on her forearm guard, not a clean contact, and stagger. And that was when Davin Reyes came around the corner. The moment billed to climax. I want to try to describe this carefully because I've told this story to a lot of people over the years, and the version that gets retold is often the simplified version. The version where it's just action, just a human soldier doing impressive things. That's not wrong, but it misses something. What I saw first was that Reyes didn't hesitate. I don't mean he was fast to react, although he was. I mean there was no visible pause, no moment of processing, no flicker of what is happening and what do I do. He came around that corner and the information registered, and he was already moving. He had a standard-issue security baton, the non-lethal impact weapon carried by station security personnel, not designed for use against Gret. That's the thing I want you to understand. The tool he had was not the right tool for the job. You don't take a security baton against 2 professional Gret mercenaries and a specialist infiltrator and walk away from it. You don't do that. Nobody should be able to do that. He did it. The first Gret was the closer one, positioned between Reyes and the princess. The Gret turned, and remember, Gret reaction time is roughly twice human baseline, turned to address this new arrival, and in the time between that turn beginning and completing, Reyes had closed the distance. I had a bad angle. I want to be honest about that. I'm not going to give you a perfect account of every movement because I couldn't see everything from where I was standing. And I've learned over the years that eyewitness accounts that claim perfect clarity are usually filling in gaps with what makes sense in hindsight. What I can tell you is what I saw clearly. I saw the first Gret go down. I don't know exactly how. The motion was too fast and too close quarters, and my angle was bad. But one moment it was upright, and the next it was not, and Ray's was already past it. The reptilian figure came off the wall. It was fast, genuinely fast, built for that kind of diagonal movement, and Ray's met it in the middle of that movement rather than waiting for it to complete. That part I saw more clearly. He went low. The figure went high. He came up on the wrong side of where it expected him to be, and whatever he did with the baton in the next 2 seconds was efficient in a way that I found difficult to watch, not because it was brutal, but because it was so precise. Like watching someone do a very difficult thing very well. The second Gret. The second Gret was the one with the suppression rod, the one that had hit Verith, and it was the one that scared me. Because by the time Ray's turned toward it, the suppression rod was leveled, and there was maybe 12 feet of space between them, and the Gret knew what it had, and Ray's absolutely knew what it had. He had a baton. The Gret had a weapon that would drop him in approximately the same way it had dropped the honor guard. I held my breath, and then something happened that I didn't understand until later. Ray stopped moving. Not retreating, not stalling, he just stopped, stood there, met the Gret's eyes, or what passes for eyes in Gret anatomy, which are these dark, compound things that don't telegraph emotion the way human eyes do, and he stood there, and his breathing changed. I couldn't hear it through the wall, but I could see it in his chest, slower, longer. And on his forearms, visible below his rolled sleeves, because he'd been off rotation when the alarm fired, not in full uniform, the marking on his right hand began to do something. That's the only way I can describe it. It began to do something. The geometric lines, the dark pattern that I'd assumed was a scar or a tattoo, they went from dark to something else. Not glowing exactly, not like a screen or a light source, more like the way iron looks when it's been in a forge long enough and it's not quite red yet, but it stopped being cold. A deep internal warming of color, the lines on his right hand, then his left, then moving up both forearms in a pattern that was too symmetrical, too structured to be random biology. The Gret hesitated. That was the thing. That was the detail that the Vethori cultural advisor later told the Incident Review Board was the detail that mattered most in the Vethori reading of the event. The Gret hesitated. Climax full detonation. I'm going to tell you what the markings were. I found out later, from a medical debrief, that I was not technically authorized to read, but that a friend in the station medical office quietly showed me anyway because she knew I'd been a witness, and she thought I deserved to understand what I'd seen. Davin Ray's had served 2 deployments on what the Galactic Survey Commission classified as Category 5 Deathworlds. A Category 5 Deathworld, for context, is a planet where the combined environmental, biological, and atmospheric hazard index exceeds survivable parameters for approximately 93% of known spacefaring species. Earth itself is a Category 3. Most inhabited worlds are Category 1 or 2. A Category 5 is the kind of place you send someone because no one else can operate there, and even then, you don't expect everyone to come back. The markings on Ray's arms were not tattoos. They were not scars in the conventional sense. They were what the medical community calls sympathetic dermal adaptation signatures, a phenomenon that occurs in approximately 1 in every 80,000 humans who undergo extended exposure to Deathworld-class environmental stressors. The body's adaptive response mechanisms, pushed far enough for long enough, produce a kind of biological record, a marking. The pattern corresponds, according to the research, to the specific combination of stressors the individual survived: the pressure, the radiation, the biological toxins, the gravitational variance. Each person's is different. No 2 are identical. They fade over time in comfortable environments and intensify under stress. Ray's had been living on Viral 9 for 8 months. Mid-Deck 7. Recycled coolant smell and flickering lights and protein paste. His markings had faded almost completely. Until the moment his body registered a genuine threat. Until the moment his nervous system, trained through 2 Deathworld deployments, and whatever else I don't have clearance to know, shifted into something that the calm morning of a trade station assignment had not required. And the Gret holding the suppression rod saw those markings come alive. Because Gret are professional mercenaries, and professional mercenaries survive by knowing what they're looking at. And what those markings meant in the galactic biological database that most sophisticated species maintain for threat assessment was not human soft-worlder guard with a baton. It meant Deathworld survivor, category indeterminate, do not engage without significant tactical advantage. The Gret with the suppression rod had a weapon that worked on Vethori nervous systems. It probably would have worked on Ray's too. Honestly, suppression rods don't check the target's background before firing. But the Gret hesitated, and in the gap of that hesitation, Ray's crossed 12 feet in a motion that I can only describe as committed. Not fast the way the Vethori honor guard was fast, not with that alien fluidity, but with the low, ground-eating, absolute forward intention of something that has decided the distance between itself, and the target is simply going to stop existing. He got inside the suppression rod's effective range. At that distance, it couldn't be used. What happened after that was close quarters and fast, and I lost track of the details again, but the outcome was clear. The Gret went down, not gently, but down. And Davin Reyes stood in a corridor with 3 incapacitated attackers, 2 of whom outmassed him by a factor of roughly 2, and he breathed for a moment, long breath, slow, the same breath I'd seen him take before, and the markings on his arms were burning at full intensity now, dark amber gold against his skin, intricate and unmistakable. He looked at Princess Vareth. She was still in her combat stance, still violet dark with the biological stress response she couldn't suppress. Her honor guard were starting to stir, recovering from the suppression pulse. The corridor smelled like ozone and the particular sharp chemical smell that Gret produce when they exert themselves. Ray said something. I couldn't hear it through the transparency panel. Later in the incident review, the translation was provided. He said, "You're okay, you're safe. Is anyone hurt?" That was it. Not "I just saved you," not "you're welcome," not "how about that, princess." Is anyone hurt? Aftermath first wave. The station security team arrived approximately 4 minutes later. 4 minutes. In the security report, this was noted as a response time that fell within acceptable parameters for a non-lethal multi-party incident in a low-traffic corridor section. 4 minutes. I thought about those 4 minutes for a long time afterward. The honor guard were on their feet by then, groggy and angry and positioning themselves around their Neris in a way that made the newly arrived security team very uncomfortable. Reyes had his hands visible, palms out, non-threatening, the universal gesture, and was speaking quietly to the lead security officer, a Draylan woman I recognized named Coordinator Vel. I watched Princess Vareth watching him. I want to be specific about this because it's the part I think about most. She had shifted color. Vethori don't control their color response. It's involuntary, the biological honest signal of their internal state. When she'd first been threatened, she'd gone violet. When the Gret had been active, she'd gone deep violet, verging on the red-black of genuine threat response. Standing in the corridor after it was over, watching Davin Reyes give his account to the security coordinator. Palms out, calm. The markings on his arms still present, but fading now as whatever his body had activated began to stand down. She was gold. Blue gold, the color the cultural briefing said meant calm. And something else the cultural briefing said. Something that the Vethori diplomatic advisor later confirmed was a significant tell in their species' emotional vocabulary. When a Vethori shifts to full blue gold in the immediate aftermath of threat, it doesn't just mean calm. It means reassessed. It means something they understood was wrong. The conversation, critical scene. 3 hours after the incident, I was in the incident documentation room compiling witness statements. Yes, they made me work, despite the fact that I had just watched the thing happen, when the junior Vethori aide, whose name was Sethril and who I'd had brief professional contact with during the intake processing, knocked on the door. "The Neris requests the presence of the human security officer," Sethril said, "the one who was in the corridor." I looked up. She requests, does she mean officially, through the diplomatic? Directly, Sethril said, and there was something careful in his voice. She made the request herself, not through the advisors. That was unusual enough that I flagged it up the chain. My supervisor flagged it up theirs. Someone eventually decided that, given the circumstances, The diplomatic optics of refusing a direct personal request from a Neris who had just survived an assassination attempt were worse than the optics of complying without extensive protocol, and Reyes was notified. I know about the conversation because Sethril told me afterward. Not officially, just told me quietly in the hallway outside the documentation room because I think he was still processing it himself and needed to tell someone. The Neris received Reyes in the Vethori Suite's formal receiving room, not the inner chamber, which would have been a private audience, but not the external antechamber either. The middle space. Sethril described it as a choice that had meaning in Vethori protocol, an acknowledgement of significance without conferring formal status. There were no interpreters. Vareth's translator implant handled it directly. She asked him, according to Sethril, "What are the markings on your arms?" And Reyes apparently looked at them, looked at his own forearms with an expression Sethril described as not pride and not embarrassment, but something he didn't have a word for, and said they were what happened when a human body had spent enough time in an environment that wanted it dead. Vareth apparently looked at him for a long time after that. Then she asked, "On your world, are these common?" Reyes said no, they weren't common, they were rare. "Then your world produces them," she said. "It does not rely on them." Reyes said that was accurate. Another pause. "My briefings on humans," she said, "described your species as a soft world evolutionary line. Mild atmospheric pressure, moderate gravity, temperate biosphere." "Earth is like that," Reyes said. "Mostly. But you are not only from Earth." And here is the part that Sethril told me with something that I can only call wonder in his voice. Because Sethril was young and had absorbed his civilization's assumptions about humans the way anyone absorbs the assumptions of their culture, without questioning them, because why would you? Reyes said, "None of us are only from Earth anymore." What he meant, what Sethril eventually understood, and I understood reading between the lines, was something that the galactic community had not quite processed about humans in the 260 years since we'd achieved interstellar travel. We hadn't stayed on Earth. We hadn't stayed in the safe places. We'd spread into the hard places, the cold places, the high-gravity places, the radiation-heavy places, the places where other species had surveyed and determined uninhabitable and moved on. We'd moved in. We'd adapted, slowly, over generations, not always by choice, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by accident, sometimes because a colony ship's navigation had an off day and the planet you landed on was not the one you'd planned. But humans had been adapting to difficult environments for hundreds of thousands of years before we ever left our own solar system, and that capacity did not switch off just because we now had spacecraft. Reyes was not an outlier. He was a data point in a pattern that Princess Vareth of the Keth bloodline had never been given accurate data on. "In your diplomatic briefings," Reyes said, "who provided the information about humans?" Sethril said Vareth went very still at that question. "The Trade Assembly's Xenological Office," she said. Reyes nodded slowly. The Trade Assembly. The same faction that had just sent 3 mercenaries to disrupt the negotiations. The same faction that had, apparently, also provided the Vethori Principality's diplomatic intelligence on the species they were dealing with. "You might want to read some different sources," Reyes said. And then Sethril told me Reyes stood and made the appropriate formal departure gesture. He'd been briefed on Vethori courtesy, apparently, had taken the time to learn it, and said before he left, "I hope your honor guard are recovering well. They moved fast. They were protecting you." He said it simply, without agenda, like it just needed to be said. And Sethril told me that, when the door closed behind the human security officer, the Neris stood in her receiving room for a long moment. And she was blue gold. Resolution, the wider effect. The negotiations resumed the following day. I want to be careful here because I'm not a diplomat and I don't have access to everything that was discussed in those rooms. What I can tell you is what was visible from where I stood, which was the administrative wing, the hallways, the cafeteria. The dynamic had shifted. Vethori court culture is highly observational. Every member of the delegation reads status signals constantly, reads them from their own hierarchy and from outside it. When the Neris changed how she signaled, the entire court adjusted. Not dramatically, not overnight, But the junior aides who had previously treated the human staff as something slightly below furniture began making eye contact. The honor guard who had stood with that particular quality of pointed disregard whenever they passed human personnel now stood differently. Less pointed, more present. I noticed it in small things. The way Sethril held the door instead of walking through ahead of me. The way the senior honor guard, a veteran soldier named Reth who had been the most unambiguously disdainful of the human delegation staff, nodded at Reyes in the cafeteria on the second day. Nodded like a peer. Reyes, predictably, nodded back and went back to his book. The negotiations concluded successfully 14 days later. A trade framework agreement, mineral rights, shipping corridor access. Some labor standards provisions that the Assembly's commercial faction apparently hated, which I chose to read as a sign that the provisions were probably fair. Reyes was reassigned 2 weeks after that, rotated out to a posting I don't have access to, somewhere in the outer rim from what I heard, the kind of place where they sent people like him. Quiet, probably. Hard, definitely. I saw him once more before he left. In the cafeteria, the same spot, the same paper book, the same protein blend that nobody could explain how he ate willingly. I sat down across from him. I wasn't sure I should. We weren't friends exactly. We'd barely spoken. But I sat down. He looked up. I saw the corridor, I said. I was at the viewport. He looked at me for a moment, took that long breath I'd come to recognize. Okay, he said. I wanted to ask the markings. When they activated, did you know that would happen? He looked at his right hand. The pattern was barely visible now, faded almost to nothing in the comfortable sameness of mid-deck 7. Not exactly, he said. My body knows before I do sometimes. You spend enough time in places that are trying to kill you, something changes, some switch gets left on. He paused. Or gets left open, I'm not sure which. Does it hurt? I asked. I'm not sure why I asked that. It seemed important somehow. He considered the question more seriously than I expected him to. No, he said. It's more like remembering. The body remembering everything it learned and deciding now is the time to use it. I sat with that for a moment. The princess, I said, she asked about you after through her aide. He didn't look surprised. He also didn't look flattered. He just listened. I think you changed something, I said. For the negotiation, for how they see, I gestured vaguely. Us. He looked at the table for a moment. Then out the small porthole window nearby, toward the Keth corridor where the ships moved like slow lights in the dark. I didn't do it for that, he said. I know. I did it because someone needed help. I nodded. He turned back to his book. After a while, I got up and let him read. Princess Varith's formal statement, interlude. The Incident Review Board published its summary report 41 days after the corridor event. Most of it was dry procedural language, recommended security rotation adjustments, analysis of the maintenance access vulnerability, background on the mercenaries and their clients. At the end, there was an appended statement from Princess Varith of the Keth bloodline, submitted voluntarily, not required. The review board protocols didn't mandate diplomatic witness statements. She submitted it anyway. I'm going to reproduce it here as accurately as I can from memory, because I read it probably 20 times and I know it well. The translation smooths some nuances. Vethori written language carries tonal information that doesn't port cleanly into galactic standard, but the substance is there. I was provided, prior to this mission, with a comprehensive xenological briefing on human biology, capability, and cultural status. This briefing was sourced from the Galactic Trade Assembly's Xenological Advisory Office. I accepted its contents without independent verification, because it came from a body I had reason to trust, and because it confirmed assumptions I already held. The briefing described humans as a soft-world evolutionary line, physically moderate in development, lacking the specialized biological adaptations of more challenging evolutionary environments. This is, I have since determined, accurate as a description of baseline human biology in temperate planetary conditions. It is not accurate as a description of what humans become. The individual designated Corporal Davin Reyes displayed, during the incident of date, biological evidence of extended adaptation to Deathworld-class environmental parameters. This evidence was not cosmetic. It was functional. It indicates a species that has not remained confined to the conditions that produced it, a species that has been intentionally and successfully adapting to extreme conditions for the entirety of its spacefaring history. I was told humans were soft-worlders. I was not told that soft-worlders had chosen to make themselves otherwise. I am submitting this statement because I believe the Vethori Principality's ongoing assessments of human capability should be revised to reflect accurate information, and because the individual who protected my life, who did so without hesitation and without any apparent calculation of personal cost, deserves the accurate record of what he is. He is not a soft-worlder in the sense that designation was meant to imply. He is something the designation was not built to contain. Neris Verith, Keth Bloodline, Vethori Principality. Later, my own reflection. I stayed on Viral 9 for another 2 years after the incident. The station changed in small ways. The diplomatic wing's human staff interacted differently with Vethori visitors, more directly, with a quality of confidence that hadn't been there before, partly because the story got around, the way stories do in small communities, and people walk differently when they feel seen. I thought about what Reyes had said, about spending time in places that are trying to kill you, about switches left open. I thought about what the Neris had written, about a species that had not remained confined to the conditions that produced it. I'm not a soldier. I've never been anywhere that wanted me dead in any serious way. My life is manifests and meeting rooms and protein paste, and the 45 minutes at the observation bay when I can just watch ships moving through the dark between stars. But I'm human, and somewhere in the database of what that means, in the deep record of what our species has been doing for the 250,000 years it existed before it ever looked up at the night sky and decided to go there, somewhere in that record is the same thing that lit up on Davin Reyes' arms in a corridor on Viral 9. The memory of difficult places. The capacity. It's there in all of us, I think, dormant mostly, faded in the comfortable light of a trade station or a city or a peaceful afternoon. But not gone. Never quite gone. Extended scene, the night before Reyes left. I heard this part from Helpless, who heard it from the Vethori senior aide who witnessed it directly. The night before Reyes' transfer, there was a small informal gathering in the diplomatic wing's neutral space, the shared lounge that both the human and Vethori delegations used during off-hours. This wasn't protocol. It wasn't arranged. It was just people who worked near each other, sharing a space, in the way that happens sometimes when the formal structure of things gives way to the human, and apparently Vethori tendency to not want to be alone in the evening. Princess Verith was there. That was unexpected. The Neris didn't typically use shared spaces, but she was there, sitting with 2 of her advisors, and when Reyes came in also unexpectedly, he wasn't someone who sought out social situations. There was a moment. Just a moment. She acknowledged him, not formally, not with the Vethori court gesture that would have conferred official status, but she looked at him and inclined her head in what Sethril described as a recognition gesture, something between a nod and a bow, a Vethori motion used between individuals of roughly equivalent standing who hold respect for each other. Reyes apparently did the approximation of the same gesture back. Imperfect, his anatomy wasn't built for the exact movement, but the intent was unmistakable. And then they both went back to their respective corners of the room and didn't speak to each other again that evening. But Helpless, who was there for the tail end of it, told me that the air in the room was different afterward. That quality of tension that had been underneath everything in the diplomatic wing for weeks, that particular hum of incompatible assumptions rubbing against each other, was quieter. Not gone, not erased by one corridor incident and one exchange of nods. But quieter. I keep thinking, Helpless said to me later in her flat, precise way, that the most significant diplomatic event of the mission was not any of the sessions I was briefed to monitor. No, I said. It was a human man standing still, she said, when all logic suggested he should not. I turned that over in my mind for a while. He didn't stand still, I said eventually. He chose what to do next, that's different. Helpless considered that. Yes, she said. That may be the distinction. Closing the long view. I'm telling this story now, years later, from a different station in a different sector, with different work that I'm not going to describe in detail, except to say it still involves manifests and meeting rooms. I've told it to maybe 20 people over the years. A few of them were human, several were not. One of them, a young Vethori aide who had just been posted to her first off-world assignment, asked me if I thought what happened in that corridor was typical of humans. I thought about it for longer than she probably expected. I think, I said, that humans are very good at becoming what the situation requires. And I think we're better at it than most species know, partly because we're better at it than we know ourselves. She considered that. Because your world was not hard enough to demonstrate it, she asked. Because our world was exactly hard enough, I said, to build it into us without making it obvious, and then we went to harder worlds, and harder ones after that. She was quiet for a moment. The trade assembly's briefing materials, she said carefully, still describe your species as soft-worlders. I know, I said. Is that a problem? I thought about a man sitting alone in a cafeteria with a paper book, eating protein paste, looking like a man who had decided the world could wait. I thought about dark amber gold lines lit up on both forearms in a hard corridor light. I thought about a Vethori princess going blue-gold in the aftermath of something she hadn't expected. It's not a problem for us, I said. She thought about that. Then she nodded. And I got back to my manifests. The galaxy has a tendency to mistake quietness for emptiness. It keeps being surprised.